100 years ago, these names were in American newspapers on many days. Harry Daugherty, Jess Smith, Roxie Stinson, Burton Wheeler, and Gaston Means. Today, those names can be found in a new book, Crooked, subtitled The Roaring Twenties Tale of a Corrupt Attorney General, a Crusading Senator, and the Birth of the American Scandal. Nathan Masters is the author, and it's his first book. Masters, for the past 7 years, has hosted a television series known as Lost L.A. He works at the University of Southern California Libraries in Los Angeles. Nathan Masters, when did you first think about a book called Crooked?
That was around 2018. I was poking around a book idea then. I was looking for what you'd call an untold story, something that was a big news event back in the time, but that hadn't been chronicled recently. But I also wanted something that reflected the present day, or that spoke to the present day. So it was 2018. I started thinking about corrupt presidential administrations. And I dug into the history of the Harding administration. Harding himself didn't seem like my man. He didn't seem like the character. He has a really crooked reputation, but was generally, I feel like he was misunderstood. He was a delegator. He was a detached president, wasn't personally corrupt. However, I came across the story of his sort of political handler, his political mentor, Harry Daugherty, and he seemed like he was really interesting. And then when I read that a United States senator started investigating Harry Daugherty, who Harding had appointed as his attorney general, and as the senator learned of the staggering corruption within the Justice Department, the fact that the Justice Department had been turned into a political weapon, and just as the senator got a little too close to the truth, he got indicted on trumped-up charges by the Justice Department. I thought, there's a great story.
So of all the characters, and we'll talk about a lot of them, which one, besides Daugherty, got your attention?
Well, the most fascinating one to me is the sort of, I'll put hero in air quotes, but the hero of the book, Burton Wheeler. He was a United States senator from Montana. When the story begins in 1923, he was just elected. He was a freshman senator. He grew up on the East Coast, went to law school at the University of Michigan. But it was really in Montana, where he moved right after law school, that he came of age in terms of his political career and his political career and his legal career. It was frontier justice ruled the day in Montana. He was a lawyer in Butte, the mining town of Butte, and corruption. The legal system was rife with corruption. The political system too. Intimidation and violence often held sway over legal arguments, and he took that background with him to Washington after serving a stint as a federal prosecutor, as the lead federal prosecutor, the U.S. attorney in Montana. How would you describe his politics? So it's interesting. He's a little bit of a political chameleon. During the book, in the time that the book is set, in the 1920s, he is a strident progressive. He's a firm believer in civil liberties, the rights of labor. He might be just about as left as you get in the United States Senate at the time. The book doesn't really touch on it except for in the epilogue, but later on, I think a lot of your listeners will be aware that Wheeler became something of a cranky conservative. He became known as a thorn in FDR's side. He opposed the New Deal. He led the movement against U.S. intervention in World War II. And many charged him with being a Nazi sympathizer. What was the Ohio Gang? The Ohio Gang was a sort of syndicate of lawyers and criminals and politicians that ruled the Ohio state government in the 19-teens. Harry Daugherty was sort of at the top of that, and his figurehead was Warren Harding. When Warren Harding ran for president in 1920 and was elected and moved to Washington, Harry Daugherty moved with him, became the attorney general, and much of the Ohio Gang moved to Washington too, and started to find themselves in positions of influence within the government or outside of the government, but operating in the shadows.
What had Harry Daugherty done before he came to Washington?
So Daugherty, he's a fascinating guy. He started out, first of all, I'll say, he's probably the one of the least qualified attorney generals in history. You think of an attorney general as somebody who has risen to the top of the legal profession. Of course, that's not actually the case, right? A lot of presidents appoint political cronies as their attorneys general. Robert Kennedy being appointed by his brother, a great example. Most recently, Alberto Gonzalez being appointed by George W. Bush. It's not uncommon for somebody without real legal chops to be appointed attorney general. But Daugherty really had very little legal practice to speak of. He did start out practicing law, but quickly shifted into lobbying. He was a political lobbyist. And he still styled himself as a lawyer, but he accepted legal fees, and I'll put that in air quotes, legal fees, in return for influence within the Ohio state government from powerful interests, railroads, etc.
Jess Smith. Who was Jess Smith?
Jess Smith is another fascinating character. Not as much as known about Jess Smith as Harry Daugherty, but he was Harry Daugherty's closest confidant. He was. I sort of speculate in the book. There's not persuasive evidence, but I'll just say that the evidence, the preponderance of the evidence suggests that Jess Smith and Harry Daugherty were lovers. Jess Smith grew up in the same town that Harry Daugherty did, Washington Courthouse. They were boyhood, Ohio. That was the county seat of Fayette County, Ohio. They were boyhood friends. Both of their fathers died young. They sort of bonded over that. And their paths diverged for a while. Harry Daugherty went into politics. Jess Smith took over the family business, which was the town's department store, and actually excelled at running that. It was a great business person. But then when Harry Daugherty became involved in Warren Harding's campaign, and Daugherty was Harding's campaign manager, Jess Smith turned over the store to somebody else and devoted his life to helping Harry Daugherty and by extension, Warren Harding.
I'll go right to the punchline on Jess Smith. Why did he commit suicide?
So he committed suicide. Well, it's really a sad story that at the root of it, it's betrayal. To him, Harry Daugherty was his life. It was his life's purpose was serving Harry Daugherty. That's how many sources that I consulted put it. In fact, some sources even go so far as to describe it as idolatry. Harry Daugherty. So let me start over. Jess Smith was involved in a lot of shady dealings in Washington under Harry Daugherty. Harry Daugherty was a smart guy. He was he wasn't a practicing lawyer, but he was a smart lawyer, and he knew that he couldn't personally be involved in anything that hinted of corruption within Washington, although there was a lot of it going on. So it was a lot easier for him, a lot more prudent for him to have a cutout, and that his cutout was his closest friend, Jess Smith. He could trust him implicitly. He didn't think that Jess Smith would betray him to anybody else, to any of his enemies. Ultimately, Jess Smith started talking a little bit too much. There were rumors were just swirling. We're talking about 1923. This is 2 full years into the Harding administration. Rumors were swirling that Harry Daugherty might be implicated in something, that there was something rotten going on within the Harding administration. This is just as Teapot Dome, which is sort of a side story in my book, just as Teapot Dome was beginning to be exposed. But there were these rumors that Harry Daugherty was involved. And as I describe it in the book, Daugherty and Harding got together and essentially decided that Jess Smith was going to be the fall guy. And when Jess Smith learned this, he was just devastated. He saw no reason to continue living. And beyond that, he thought that his own death might be helpful. So he took out a revolver in the room that he shared with the Attorney General in a hotel in Washington and shot himself.
You remember how old he was when he did this?
Not exactly, but he was in his 50s.
Go to Teapot Dome, because it comes up all the time over years and books and all that. Where did the name come from? The exact name, Teapot Dome.
Right. It's such a colorful name, too, right? And we probably wouldn't remember that scandal as well if it didn't have it. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I think my story, the story of the Justice Department, isn't better known. It doesn't have a great name, right? It doesn't have there's no good branding there. But yeah, Teapot Dome was the name of a rock formation in Wyoming that looked like a teapot. It had a handle and a spout, and it was one of the largest oil reserves within the nation. It was a naval oil reserve, a naval petroleum reserve, which means that there was this deep underwater reservoir of petroleum that was being held in case the U.S. entered a war in the future, and that oil could quickly be pumped out and put into ships. Of course, that is not how the oil was ultimately used.
How was it used? Where's the scandal involved?
So the scandal comes in 1921 when the Harding administration takes office. And despite the fact that previous administrations had looked at Teapot Dome as something to conserve for future use, it was a national asset. The Harding administration looked at it as something that could be privatized, that could be put to use immediately. They weren't firm believers in conservation. That alone wasn't necessarily too controversial. What was controversial, where the scandal came in, is how the Interior Secretary, Albert Fall, at the time, transferred the drilling right, or gave the drilling rights to the Teapot Dome oil field to a private oil company without any public bidding. Everything was done secretly. In fact, the oil contract wasn't revealed until a year after it was executed.
So who, over the Teapot Dome scandal, did anybody go to prison? And I know there are two names that you talk about in your book: Sinclair, which used to have a lot of Sinclair gas stations in this country, and
still are, yeah,
and Daugherty.
Right. Yeah, so those were the two main oil men involved. Harry Sinclair, he was the one who won the rights, or who bribed his way to the rights to the Teapot Dome oil field. Ultimately, it came out that there were huge bribes involved in persuading Albert Fall to give the rights to Harry Sinclair and Edward Daugherty. As a Los Angeles guy, Edward Daugherty is a huge name there still. The main library at USC is named after his son. He ran a company called Pan Pacific Petroleum. He won the rights to another naval petroleum reserve in California called Elk Hills. Ultimately, both of the oil men involved escaped prison. There were eventually prosecutions. The only person to go to prison as a result of those prosecutions was Albert Fall. He's in fact, I believe he's the only, or he was at least the first cabinet secretary to go to prison.
How much money was involved in this, and how many people got a payoff in the government?
We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars at the time, which is, of course, you can probably multiply that by 10 today to get to today's currency. And the bribes were huge. Albert Fall, and in fact, it's sort of funny the way the bribes were revealed. Albert Fall, when he took office as Interior Secretary, was on the verge of bankruptcy. He was a rancher in New Mexico, but his ranch was dilapidated. He had a rutted dirt road leading to his ranch. The fences were falling down. A couple years later, somebody who had observed these conditions came by again and noticed that, there was a shiny paved road. There was a brand new fence lining the ranch. The ranch had its own private power plant. He'd bought, Albert Fall had bought all of the land surrounding his ranch. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, which again at the time was a lot of money. Fall also managed somehow, despite the $11,000 salary of a cabinet secretary, to pay off staggering tax debts to both the state and the federal government.
Andrew John Volstead was a congressman from Minnesota. I can remember all my life hearing about the Volstead Act. And the reason I bring it up is because the effect of that was around the time that you're writing. What was it? And what impact did it have on the era that you're writing about?
Yeah, the Volstead Act plays a huge role in this story. The Volstead Act was the legislation to enforce Prohibition, right, which was enacted by constitutional amendment, but the constitutional amendment didn't really say much. So there needed to be it effectively said that the sale, use, or manufacture of intoxicating spirits is prohibited, but there needed to be legislation to direct the executive branch as to how to carry out that amendment. Of course, it was widely scorned almost immediately by this new cottage industry of bootleggers. Almost immediately, either people who had already been involved in the alcohol business or who more recently got involved. We have a great character in the book named George Remus who does that. They find loopholes in the law. They find ways to just flout the law flagrantly.
How much of the alcohol was stored in government warehouses, and tell us about George Remus, who he was?
Yeah, George Remus was a pharmacist turned lawyer turned bootlegger from Cincinnati, Ohio. Remus soon after, so he was a lawyer. He was a practicing lawyer when Prohibition went into effect. Started representing a lot of bootleggers who, in the process of representing these bootleggers, learned that they were incredibly well off, and that they were making much more money than he ever was as a lawyer. He figured, he was a smart guy. He knew the law. He knew the pharmacy business too. He could find a way around the Volstead Act. And so he came up with this scheme to buy up a bunch of pharmacy businesses. He retired from the law and sold and distributed what was described as medicinal whiskey, which was one of the loopholes that was written into the Volstead Act, right? Because there was an argument that whiskey or any sort of alcoholic spirit could be used as medication. So he distributed that under the guise of a pharmacy and made millions of dollars. In fact, he was famously suddenly rich, and some people think that he inspired the character of Jay Gatsby.
What happened to him?
He was the target of a protracted investigation by one of the few Justice Department assistant attorneys general who wasn't subject to corruption. She was one of the few upstanding ones. And in fact, one of the first, or I believe the second, women assistant attorneys general, Mabel Walker Willebrandt. She doggedly pursued Remus and put him behind bars for violating the Volstead Act. He found a lot of loopholes, but eventually he got too cocky.
As you know, the 1920 era, women got the right to vote, and then you had 13 years of Prohibition.
Yeah.
What did those two things have? What kind of impact did they have on the society? And along the way, you still have Harry Daugherty as the Attorney General. And did he take any money from the story you're telling about the Prohibition? And what impact did it have in the 20 election with women's having a right to vote?
Well, the 1920 election, a lot of sources that I consulted said that the women's enfranchisement probably tipped the scales in that election. Although the Democrats ran a terrible campaign in that year, and Warren Harding had a lot going for him in that he had this sunny disposition. He was promising, famously, the return to normalcy after years of war and labor strife and pandemic. But the Republicans at the time really appealed to the newly enfranchised women voters, and in fact, the 19th Amendment also probably inspired Harry Daugherty's appointment of Mabel Walker Rulebrand. He thought, here's this brand new constituency. We need to do something to appeal to them.
Did Daugherty take money in the story that you told?
Oh, he did. I don't have any direct evidence that he took bootlegger money or liquor money, but he took money related to it's a complicated story, but related to assets that were seized during World War II, and that he took bribes to facilitate the return of those assets to their original owners.
This is a complicated story, as you know. You spent several years on it.
I do.
And it's hard in an hour conversation to cover it all. So I guess that's my way of saying if you really get interested in it, you better go buy the book, because it's a complicated story, as I said. Tell us, there are two tracks, the Wheeler track and the Daugherty track, and the indictments and the hearings and all that. Can you summarize those two tracks and kind of what happened to both men in the course of your story?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So, Wheeler comes into office already pledging to try to get something on Harry Daugherty. So the book actually begins with what was described at the time as a gross overreach by Attorney General Daugherty. He persuaded a court in Chicago to issue the most sweeping injunction in American history against the labor movement that ended a strike and prohibited picketing strikers from picketing or from making any sort of public comments about the strike. Wheeler, as a champion of labor, was really offended by that, and he promised to do something about it. So after he gets elected to the Senate, he bides his time, but eventually finds the opportunity to investigate Harry Daugherty when Harry Daugherty is sort of just sitting on his hands as all of these astounding revelations come out related to Teapot Dome. Right? There's another set of hearings at the time in the Senate led by Wheeler's friend Thomas Walsh that are revealing the staggering corruption in the Interior Department around those two naval oil reserves. Harry Daugherty does nothing. It seems like Senator Walsh was doing a favor to the Justice Department in exposing this criminal conspiracy, but the Justice Department refused to do anything. It didn't assign any prosecutors. It didn't even open the Bureau of Investigation, which was the forerunner to the FBI. Didn't even open a case file. Ultimately, of course, President Coolidge gets involved and orders an investigation, overrides his attorney general, which was an almost unprecedented act. And two special prosecutors get involved who operate independently of Daugherty's influence. But at that time, Wheeler thinks there's actually this great political outcry against Harry Daugherty for doing nothing. So this is his opportunity to investigate. So he launches a Senate investigation. He has a committee impaneled, a committee of 5. It's stacked 3-2 towards the Republicans, which that was the administration that was in power. But at the time, party lines weren't. They were a little bit blurred, right? There were progressive Republicans and there were conservative Democrats. And when the committee started operating, it turned out that there was a 3-2 majority for having an earnest, real investigation of Harry Daugherty. And they elected. Yeah.
Who came to the committee hearings that did the most damage to Harry Daugherty?
The first 2 witnesses, I would say. The first witness was Jess Smith's ex-wife, and that Jess Smith, as you recall, was Harry Daugherty's roommate and closest friend. She had, over the years, heard so many suggestions of over the last 2 years. Had heard so many suggestions of corruption. Of Jess Smith had been bragging about what he and Harry had been doing together in Washington.
And by the way, her name was Roxie Stinson.
Yes, thank you. I forgot to mention that.
No,
yes.
but the reason the name itself. What was she like, and how long was she married to Jess Smith?
Yeah, she was married to Jess Smith for a short time, about 10 years before the time the story takes place. The marriage, for obvious reasons, didn't work out, but they stayed really close. In fact, they were best friends. She was a charming figure. When she arrived in the Senate hearing room, she made jokes. She got the entire audience laughing. She sobbed whenever her dead ex-husband was brought up. So she appealed to the emotions of the crowd. She was probably the perfect witness for Burton Wheeler. And she recalled all of these times that Jess Smith had been bragging about the deals that he and Harry had been making. She didn't have any hard evidence, but there was certainly enough there to convince a lot of people who had previously been skeptical that there was really something rotten within the Justice Department.
How many days was she on the stand?
She was on the stand ultimately, I believe, 5 or 6 days. It was really the first couple days that made the biggest impact.
What would have been like today if somebody like Roxie Stinson in the television age was to be in front of a committee like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So everything would have been amplified. Part of the point that I make in my book is that this was really the first moment when colorful characters like Roxie Stinson or another witness, Gaston Means, where they could really make an impact and where their words would be immediately transmitted across the country. There was a new style of journalism had emerged that critics refer to as jazz journalism. There was, radio was just beginning to emerge as a medium, but every day people would tune in to the news on the radio, and they would hear what had happened in the hearings. But yeah, everything would have been completely amplified if it had been televised. What
impact did Roxie Stinson's testimony have on Harry Daugherty?
He was infuriated. First of all, he wasn't surprised. There's a little side story in the book about how she had essentially tried to blackmail him. She knew that she had something on him. She knew that he was coming under suspicion. She tried to blackmail him. He tried to silence her. He wanted her out of the country. But ultimately, when she complied with the Senate subpoena that Wheeler personally delivered in Ohio, he took an overnight train to Ohio just to deliver the Senate subpoena. He was worried that Harry Daugherty's operatives would get their hands on her first. She complied with the subpoena. She testified the very next day in Washington, and he was infuriated. And he had, even as she had been threatening to blackmail him, he had collected some blackmail himself on Roxie Stinson. And as soon as she testified, he deployed it. He intimated that she had been involved in an affair with a married man.
Gaston Means. What's his story?
Yeah. So he is probably the most colorful character of all in this book. He was a private detective for a while. He was a con artist. At the time that the book starts, he was just on his way out of the Bureau of Investigation as a secretly appointed special agent. He was essentially Harry Daugherty, or Jess Smith's, I should say, secret operator. He was a very good friend with the director of the Bureau of Investigation, William Burns, who was also a shady character. He's a member of the Ohio gang, a longtime friend himself of Harry Daugherty's. But Gaston Means he carried out a lot of the dirty tricks on behalf of Daugherty and Jess Smith. He ransacked senators' offices. Whenever a congressman made a snide remark about the attorney general on the floor of the House or of the Senate, often they would find their office broken into the next day, files missing. Gaston Means carried out a lot of that work.
How bad a guy was Harry Daugherty?
I think he was a pretty bad guy. He operated the Justice Department as a gangster would. I mean, with some limits. I don't think he would ever go so far as murder, but that's not really paying him a compliment.
So what was Harry Daugherty's reaction to Burton Wheeler? What did he do about him, the other side of this story?
So Daugherty was no stranger to congressional criticism, right? It had come up many times, and again, he or Jess Smith, again, he always maintained plausible deniability. There's no evidence that Harry Daugherty was ever really involved in these operations, but whenever a member of Congress would criticize him, he'd find some compromising material on this person and say, hey, you might want to quiet down. Otherwise, these are the consequences. So, he got to work. His agents got to work on Burton Wheeler when Wheeler started criticizing him. And in fact, there are news reports. It was publicly reported that Daugherty huddled with his Bureau of Investigation director, Billy Burns, at the time, to try to figure out a way to silence Wheeler. So he, soon after, in concert with the Republican National Committee, almost an army of private detectives and Bureau of Investigation special agents and Justice Department personnel fanned out across Montana in search of compromising information on Burton Wheeler.
Did they find anything?
Well, they had a lot of false leads. Wheeler was... There's no evidence that Wheeler was ever involved in anything corrupt in Montana, which was probably a surprise to the people who were looking into it. They, Montana's political system was famously corrupt, but Wheeler was one of the few who stood above that. Ultimately, they looked into, or a private detective working for the Republican National Committee, which allowed him a little bit more flexibility than a Justice Department employee would have. Started looking into Wheeler's legal practice, because at the time it wasn't uncommon for members of Congress to maintain a legal practice. The only rule was that they couldn't really be involved in any cases or controversies affecting the federal government. So they had to limit their activities to state courts. And Wheeler was representing an oil company, a Montana oil company that had a lot of litigation in the Montana state courts. But this private detective found that he might have also been involved in setting up a meeting for this oil company with the Interior Department, because the oil company was trying to get leasing permits to an oil field in Montana. And it really wasn't much, but that was about all that the investigators found, and they just ran with it.
How did they run with it?
Well, they took the evidence that they found, which was real evidence from there were sworn affidavits from employees of the oil company. There were documents from the oil company. They presented this evidence to a grand jury, or actually I should say that a U.S. attorney in Montana who had been essentially blackmailed by the attorney general presented the evidence to a grand jury in Montana and presented it in a way, they put a spin on it and persuaded the grand jury, which, we've all heard the phrase like a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. They indicted a sitting senator, which was at the time a very unusual thing. There had been a few senators indicted in the past, but it was very unusual. And it was especially astounding that the most prominent critic of the Justice Department, Burton Wheeler, would be indicted at the time by the Justice Department.
Was there a trial?
There was a trial. And that's the sort of climax of the story. Yeah, there were actually two trials. There was one, first of all, in the United States Senate. The Senate had to determine whether Wheeler was fit to remain a senator under these, because it was a serious charge. I think it was a misdemeanor charge, but it was a federal indictment. It's unusual to have an indicted person sitting in the Senate. The Senate exonerated him, but they didn't really look into the facts too much. The trial happened about a year later, and during the trial, or in the opening arguments of the trial, the lead prosecutor promised a surprise witness that would totally change the public's conception of the case. And that surprise witness came in a few days later and told this completely fabricated tale about Burton Wheeler being involved in this conspiracy, accepting thousands of dollars to turn oil cases before the Interior Department in favor of his client.
Who was the surprise witness?
The surprise witness turned out to be somebody who had testified to Wheeler's own committee. And Wheeler had, one of the things I get at in the book is that, Wheeler, and I'm making Wheeler out to sound like just a completely heroic figure, but he had faults of his own. He got a little carried away. He didn't always hew too closely to the facts. He was infatuated with the reaction that his words would make in print. And so he humiliated this witness, George B. Hayes, before his committee, or he allowed another witness to do that. Hayes was, embarrassed. He pledged revenge, and eventually, when a Department of Justice prosecutor came calling, this witness Hayes found his opportunity for revenge against Wheeler.
After the trial, what did the jury decide?
Yeah, so there was some suspense as to what the jury would say, right? The Justice Department had proven itself very effective at getting its way. It had indicted Wheeler really on trumped up charges. Even though Harry Daugherty was no longer in office, he'd resigned. It was an open question whether the jury would exonerate or would acquit Wheeler. But ultimately they did. They voted unanimously to acquit Wheeler. And in just an amazing scene that, again, you wouldn't believe it if it hadn't happened. The very moment that Wheeler learned that he had been acquitted, he also learned that his wife had given birth to their most recent child thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C.
So what was the biggest help to you to put all this together?
So I think the biggest help sounds very simple, but it would have been my timeline. There is, as you pointed out, there's a lot going on here. It's very complicated. So I created a very detailed chronological timeline of all of the events. And what's interesting about that, again, it sounds very basic, but when you do that, you see patterns emerge. You see, oh, this thing happened a short time after that. And that's what I was able to, just by doing that, I was able to make, original discoveries that, for instance, how Harry Daugherty had come to recruit this special prosecutor within the Justice Department to go after Burton Wheeler, which is something that I made this discovery in the National Archives, but I didn't realize its significance until I put it in the timeline.
What were your other sources? Did you read all 3,000 pages of testimony?
You know what? I didn't read all 3,000 pages. I'll be honest. A lot of the testimony turned out not to be relevant to either to my story or Burton Wheeler went to a lot of dead ends. But I read thousands and thousands of pages of testimony, of FBI records. In fact, FBI records that I obtained by the Freedom of Information Act turned out to be one of the biggest sources. There was an extensive file, of course, on Burton Wheeler. We're talking about thousands and thousands of pages, hundreds of serials, a lot of them dead ends, but then a lot of that file details the Justice Department's surveillance of Wheeler, of witnesses during the trial. Other primary sources that I consulted were the Justice Department records at the National Archives. And those were probably just as helpful as the FBI records. Those were the files that the lawyers kept about the cases, about the prosecution of Wheeler, about responses to requests from the committee that was investigating the Justice Department. And then another huge suite of sources came from the Library of Congress, too, manuscript collections there.
So this is your first book, And how did you get ready for that? What kind of background did you need in order to write your first book? And what's your full-time job?
Yeah, my full-time job, I work at the University of Southern California Libraries. I actually work in a building named after Edward Daugherty, one of the oil men who was involved in Teapot Dome. So I work in a university library. I also host a public television show and produce a public television show called Lost LA, which explores Los Angeles history through archives. So I have a lot of experience working with archival materials and presenting them in a compelling way to the public, hopefully a compelling way. How did I prepare myself for the book? Well, I just, I had a great editor, I had a great agent who, my agent, Samantha Shea, really helped me put together a proposal. I mean, there is a bit of a learning curve for a first-time author, putting together a proposal, and then, it's something new. But I had a lot of help.
Carrie Napolitano.
Yeah.
You referenced in the book, and then you get an endorsement from Janet Napolitano. Any relationship?
Yes, I believe Janet Napolitano is Carrie Napolitano's aunt.
But I just ask you, how did you get an endorsement for this book from Janet Napolitano?
I believe Carrie asked. So Sam Rame was the editor who worked with me on the manuscript, and he left Hachette Books right after I turned in my final draft, which was great timing. And then Carrie Napolitano took over the project, and when she read the book, she thought, "Oh, this would be perfect for my aunt Janet Napolitano." So she very generously asked her to read it, and apparently Janet Napolitano reads like a book a week or 2 books a week. So she had time to do it and liked it and gave an endorsement.
What have you heard from people that have read your book? What are the kind of things they say back to you about your work, and what intrigued them?
Well, I'm really honored by some of the early praise that it's getting. I was a huge fan of Garrett Graff's Watergate book. I don't know if you read that, but that came out maybe a year or 2 ago. And I had just read that after I'd finished the manuscript, and I thought, these are scandals that are separated in time by 50 years, but there's so much similarity between the two. The absurdities and the twists. And so I wanted to share it with him, and he very graciously agreed to read it and liked it. And getting an endorsement from somebody like him is a real honor.
So we're talking 100 years ago.
Yeah.
We're talking 1921, 22, 23. We need to, I should ask you this. Wheeler ends up running for vice president and gets a lot of votes with his running mate. How did that happen?
Yeah, a lot happens in this book, right? And I hope that I succeeded in telling it coherently. But yes, in 1924, Wheeler had succeeded in getting Harry Daugherty to resign. He put so much public pressure on President Calvin Coolidge, who at the time was running for re-election as president, was in the middle of a primary campaign. He had primary challengers within the Republican Party. This pressure was effective, and Wheeler persuaded Coolidge to fire Daugherty. Daugherty did go, and Wheeler was triumphant, and that catapulted him to national fame. Again, this was the first time that a political scandal had really captured the entire nation's imagination. So Wheeler was all of a sudden a political celebrity. The Democratic Party wanted him to run for vice president. The nominee at the time wanted him to run. But the nominee was a conservative Democrat whose politics Wheeler detested. Wheeler actually said, "I'm essentially leaving the Democratic Party." Soon after, Bob La Follette, the progressive Republican, and another maverick senator, and somebody who had become a bit of a mentor to Wheeler, asked him to be his running mate. La Follette was running. He was staging a third-party challenge to Coolidge and the Democratic nominee Davis, and La Follette, Wheeler agreed to be his running mate.
Well, the interesting thing is that they got something like 18% of the vote in that election, which is one of the highest in history.
It's true, and they hoped that it would be a lot higher. And there was a time when it seemed like it could be. Some of the polling was, of course, in a very primitive state at the time. But some of the public polling suggested that there could be what would amount to a three-way tie, or there would be a deadlock that would send the election to the House of Representatives. And the progressives held out hope that either La Follette would be elected by the House, or I guess La Follette wouldn't have been elected by the House. They held out hope that this was almost a pipe dream, but publications like The Nation speculated about it seriously, that Burton Wheeler would become acting president. He would be elected by the Senate to break a deadlock. The House of Representatives would remain deadlocked. He'd become acting president.
Let me correct myself. I said 18%. It was only 16%. Coolidge got
still very substantial.
Yeah, and Coolidge got 54% in that election. Go back to you tell the story about how Wheeler was able to push Coolidge to send Harry Daugherty back to private life. What's the backstory on that, and how did that happen? And what year did he do that? We haven't talked much about Harding's death in the middle of all this, which made Coolidge president.
Yeah, so let's start there. Warren Harding died rather suddenly in the summer of 1923. He was on a very ambitious tour of the Western United States. He visited Alaska. He drove a locomotive. He climbed hundreds of steps. He drove, ceremonial spikes into railroads. And he was in poor health, and he died. He had a very weak heart. He had heart disease that was misdiagnosed by his homeopathic doctor, and died in a San Francisco hotel room in the summer of 1923. And his obscure, at the time, Vice President Calvin Coolidge was suddenly thrust into office. And for Harry Daugherty, this was a really harrowing turn of events, because Daugherty, of course, had every reason to expect loyalty from Warren Harding, but Calvin Coolidge owed nothing to him, which meant that not only was his grip on his office insecure, but who knew what Coolidge would do if he learned about what was really happening within the Justice Department and within his own apartment suite.
Why does everybody give Warren Harding a pass on all this corruption in his administration?
I mean, that's a fair question. And I didn't mean to suggest earlier that I give him a pass.
But as you know, a lot of historians have. And yes. A lot of people that talk about Harding, they say, well, he wasn't crooked, but all these people around him were.
So some things that I can say in his favor is that he learned of these scandals relatively late. He was probably genuinely unaware of what was going on. He cultivated this sense of this is the boys' club. We'll take care of everybody. But he didn't really know what was happening. When he did start to learn, he got involved, and he, in fact, on this trip through the West, he received apparently disturbing news about what was happening within the Justice Department. And nobody really knows what he resolved to do, but Harry Daugherty suddenly became scared, took a train out himself to meet up with Harding, met with him privately a couple times. I think suggestions that Harding was about to act maybe absolve him a little bit.
What before we end this, a couple of questions about Wheeler. He was 92 when he died.
Yes.
What did he do after 1947 when he left the Senate?
He actually remained in Washington, D.C. and worked as a lawyer.
Was he involved in lobbying?
I believe he was. He also represented occasionally, and somewhat ironically, represented witnesses who appeared before congressional committees.
And what did Harry Daugherty do after he left the Attorney General's spot?
Yeah, he never held public office again. That's one of the points I really make at the end of the book, is that Daugherty never spent a day in jail. He was indicted. His successor, Harlan Fiske Stone, to his credit, pursued Daugherty. Daugherty was indicted, tried twice. Both times the jury it ended in a hung jury. There were mistrials. So he never spent a day in jail. But he was widely discredited. He was, the nation knew that he was a crook. He spent the rest of his life trying to restore his legacy. He wrote a very self-serving memoir, but really lived out his last few days in obscurity.
Did Roxie Stinson write a book?
I wish she had. That would have been an amazing source. There's so many characters I wish had written books. Thankfully, Daugherty and Wheeler both did, and of course, I had to discount some of the claims they made. No, Roxie Stinson, soon after these hearings, soon after she was involved in the Wheeler Daugherty hearings, she said she'd had enough of it. She remarried and lived a very quiet life for several decades. And
I gather, I checked that she lived to be 83 years old and died in 1973. So she lived a long time after all this.
That's right. And she was largely forgotten until her death. And then all of a sudden these obituaries came out explaining her role in exposing one of the greatest corruption scandals in American history. And I'm sure even some of her neighbors were shocked to learn of her role in that.
Now, after your experience of writing this first book, did you find characters in here you wanted to write another book about?
I mean, I've thought about it. Gaston Means is fascinating. But again, it's always hard to figure out what the truth is with him. He's a serial liar, fabulous. Burton Wheeler, again, there's a story to be told about his sort of political evolution, how he changed from what you'd almost say from a hero to a villain in I guess our public memory, and that he was really squarely on the wrong side of the question of intervention in World War II. There's a lot there, and I sort of explained that the origins of that transformation are in the book, are in the story. He was really interested in publicity and courting publicity, and but I'm not sure if that's a book I'm going to write.
So Billy Burns, you mentioned earlier, but right behind Billy Burns, who ran what was the office that turned into the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. What role did both of those men play back in the 1920s in this book?
Yeah, so William Burns, Billy Burns, was, again, he was a boyhood friend or a longtime friend of Harry Daugherty, one of his most loyal lieutenants, allowed Daugherty to transform the Bureau of Investigation into a political weapon against Daugherty's enemies. His deputy at the time was a man who then went by the name John Edgar Hoover, who was already somewhat famous for leading the Palmer raids against leftist radicals in the years after World War I. When Burns was forced to resign by Harry Daugherty's successor because of his role in all of these scandals, Hoover became the acting director and was sort of put on a trial run. He was put on a probationary period to see how he would perform as acting director. One of the great ironies is that, 6 months later, the Attorney General, Harlan Fiske Stone, made Hoover's appointment permanent. Didn't know really how permanent that would be. But one of the great ironies of this story is that, Wheeler's crusade against the Department of Justice and the Bureau as a political weapon resulted in J. Edgar Hoover's appointment as director. And of course, Hoover would come to use the Bureau for political means, or the FBI for political means for decades to come.
How much were the people in the early 1920s in this country aware of all this that you're writing about?
They were very aware. This was, at the time, this was the Roaring '20s. Again, journalism had just then found a way to send stories across the country. The entire country would. They would huddle around their radios at night, or they would, in the morning, they gossip about the latest news, either in this scandal or in the murder or the manslaughter trial of actor Fatty Arbuckle, for instance, or they'd all talk about the boxing match between Carpentier and Dempsey, or there were these stories that captivated the entire nation. And I'm sure not everybody was aware, but for the first time in American history, really a large percentage of the American public was following what was happening in Washington, at least when men like Burton Wheeler could make it into a compelling story.
As we wrap it up, what about you? Where are you from originally?
I'm from Orange County, California.
Where'd you go to college?
University of California, Irvine.
And then what drew you to the libraries of University of Southern California?
Well, I've always just loved books, loved libraries, and the libraries gave me a way to explore my interest in history through the archives, through public programming, through work that I do like Lost LA, the television series. It's been a great fit.
When is Lost LA on television in Los Angeles?
Yeah, it's on. Well, right now we're on hiatus, but we have another season coming out in this fall.
How long are the programs?
They're half-hour episodes. We have our most of our seasons are about 6 episodes, and we try to come out, about every year with a new season.
And if people watch it out there, which I assume they do, what are they getting on a week-to-week basis?
Yeah, each week we explore just a different theme or a different story from Los Angeles history. We've told the story of the Japanese incarceration during World War II. We've told the story of a doll company that made ethnically correct black dolls in Watts in the aftermath of the Watts riots. All sorts of stories.
So, whose idea was it to name this book Crooked?
That was mine. I'm proud to say. That was on the original proposal.
Our guest has been Nathan Masters. The book, as we just said, is Crooked. The subtitle, The Roaring Twenties, Tale of a Corrupt Attorney General, a Crusading Senator, and the Birth of the American Political Scandal. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.